Hi there, my name is Philip D and I work in the Faculty of Health's Academic Development Department, or ADD. It was previously known as the PDD, the Personal Development Department. And this is the second in a series of 5 videos covering key concepts of quantitative systematic reviews. So here's a reminder of the intended playlist for the video series, helping you to undertake your own quantitative systematic review. In video 1, I covered in broad terms what a systematic review is, why we should carry one out, and the main components that make up a systematic review as a piece of research, thinking in particular about you doing this as the final component to your MSc. This second video will be a deep dive into an actual published systematic review. Now, I decided against showing an actual submitted BCU MSc dissertation, as I feel a paper such as the one I will focus on here is in effect a condensed version of the report that you will be undertaking. So to make it as relevant as possible for you and your own dissertation, I have chosen a recent paper that a Faculty of Health's BCU student has published based on her MSc. She's a nurse, and it will therefore have relevance to the themes and the sort of structure that you will engage in, although by its very nature the research paper was restricted much more in word count than will be the case for you in your dissertation write-up. After this video, the remaining videos will focus on understanding the type of statistics you will come across, first in primary research papers, and then the statistics that lie behind a meta-analysis. And finally, in the last video, I will show you how to actually carry out a meta-analysis using the freely available program RevMan. So let me introduce the paper we'll be looking at in detail. I showed elements of this in video 1. It's a comparison between 2 methods of warming patients whilst in the operating theatre environment in order to prevent hypothermia. It was published in 2020 in the Journal of Clinical Nursing. The hope is that we can start to demystify a lot of the jargon of a systematic review and see what is in effect a job list of the tasks that will build towards your own systematic review. You can readily find a PDF of this paper via a search on Google Scholar, and the full reference will be given at the end. I feel the best way to explore the process of a systematic review is to take each section of the paper in order, which will hopefully help you in seeing how it all comes together. Now, do be aware, however, that you might not be writing your systematic review in exactly the same order in which it is finally presented. It's common, for example, to write the final version of the introduction towards the end of your review journey. And certainly the full abstract is not written until the very end. Okay, so whilst I will show the great majority of this paper, I don't intend for this to be a simple read-through, although please do feel free at any point to either pause the recording or to consult the slides in order to read the full text in your own time. So let's start with our abstract. As we know, the abstract is a brief overview of the entire paper given at the very beginning, and you'll produce one for your own systematic review dissertation. Of course, it is written right at the very end of the process, but it is positioned right after the title and before the introduction. Here we can see the research area, which, as I have said, is comparing warming strategies used during operations to address hypothermia. The aim of this systematic review, therefore, is to evaluate the comparative effectiveness between 2 approaches, what is known as the forced air warming, or FAW approach, and the carbon fibre polymer fabric heating approach, later in the paper called CFH for short. We are giving a list of the databases that were consulted, namely CINAHL, Medline, PubMed, Embase, and what I'd not heard before prior to this research, namely the Foreign Medical Literature Service, and these are all readily available via the BCU Library homepage. We are told the appraisal of quality was carried out using the Cochrane's own risk of bias tool. Now, this is a tool rather like the CASP tool, which you may already be aware of. We are told that a meta-analysis was used to synthesize the data, and that the robustness of that synthesis was subsequently tested using something called a sensitivity analysis. After their careful and rigorous filtering process, this systematic review only had 5 randomized control trial papers to work with, which is not that unusual a number, but that in total these 5 papers represented 282 patients, which is a pretty good overall sample size. We are told that whilst 4 of the papers showed no statistically significant difference between the 2 approaches, 1 paper alone did show a statistically significant difference in that the forced air warming FAW was deemed the better approach. Now this should immediately alert us to looking very carefully at their results to see if there is a big contrast between the findings across the various papers. I am wary here of only 1 out of the 5 papers showing a conclusive result. And you should already be realizing that a systematic review is an active piece of research on your part, and critical appraisal forms a key element of this process. Their conclusion, unsurprisingly, states that the FAW approach is the better approach, but warns that even with its usage in an operating theatre, hypothermia could still occur. Okay, on to the main part of their paper, which will now go into far greater detail than the abstract was able to do. Now, the point of an introduction, be it in a student assignment or in a published research paper, is to firstly set the scene. The introduction announces the broad area of research, which in the case of this paper is to consider one aspect of intraoperative care, i.e. the care of a patient during their operation. More specifically, the paper is intended in preventing, or at least reducing, the incidence of hypothermia. This section of their write-up could also be where the background literature considered moves from a reflection of what was the scoping exercise to become a motivation for the need for what becomes the review question. From here on, do feel free, as I've said, to pause recording if you want to read their text in full for yourself. So right out the gate, we are introduced to the area of interest, unintentional intraoperative hypothermia, or UIH, and we are given a definition. We are given plenty of recent peer-reviewed references and then given some key statistics regarding incidence rates in the UK between the early 1980s and 2009. And this shows worryingly that UIH has been increasing in that time. However, a large study later on in 2016 showed a much lower figure than those preceding it. So clearly there is no consensus in the published research, and I would be surprised if there was. This is clearly a treatable condition, so these varying values may simply indicate different approaches tried out through the years. I'm not going to worry here about the statistics quoted, particularly the confidence intervals, as I will be covering such concepts in the very next video. So continuing with their introduction, they then go on to talk about the clinical consequences for a patient suffering from hypothermia, as well as the financial burden to the patients, and I suppose we can assume by implication to the NHS. We are then introduced to the 2 approaches that will be the focus of this systematic review, namely the forced air warming FAW system and the carbon fibre polymer fabric resistive heating, or CFH system. The FAW system, we are told, has been in use for the last 20 years. They omit, unfortunately, to say how long the CFH system has been in use. Nearing the end of their introduction now, we are given through the literature a comparison of these 2 approaches to avoid hypothermia in patients, but already we are forewarned of the difficulties of a clean comparison because of the complex conditions of patients, from which we can infer plenty of potential for confounding variables to mask the relative effects. This last bit of introduction leads to the research question for this study, namely the comparative effectiveness of the FAW and the CFH approaches as preventative measures for hypothermia during elective abdominal operations. Okay, so we have the research question motivated and formulated. Now on to their methodology. We know from the title of the paper that this is a systematic review, and so the methodology section gives a close description of the steps that were taken to carry this out. In their case, they have 5 components given helpfully as subheadings, and these are, after a reminder of the review questions, their search strategy, the inclusion criteria, which is actually a careful discussion explaining their inclusion-exclusion criteria, selection of studies where they tell us which studies were provisionally selected in the light of their inclusion-exclusion criteria, the study quality assessment, and here they give a deep dive into a quality assessment of each of their selected papers, and finally, synthesis, which is a description of the synthesis, otherwise known as pooling, of their data. We are told that their entire review adhered to the PRISMA reporting checklist, a discussion of which can be found by clicking on this link in the PDF version of these slides. Essentially, it offers a 27-item checklist which can act as a very useful report plan for your own write-up. Talk to your own supervisor about whether this would be useful in your case. But let me here show you this 8-page document, and specifically pages 5 and 6, which give the actual list. So here is the PRISMA paper. If I go on to page 5, okay, here we have the checklist of items to include. It's actually very useful, I feel, because it not only gives you the section title, but also gives you a little bit of detail about what that title means. And this particular part of the PDF just runs over 1 and a bit pages. And I recommend that you do look at it because I feel it will be of some use to your own writing. Okay, so to start off, as I said, the reminders that their review question, namely a comparison of the effectiveness between CFH and FAW approaches to preventing hypothermia in patients undergoing elective abdominal surgery. They next break this question down using the PCOD structure. So in this review, we have P, i.e. the participants, and these are surgical patients undergoing elective abdominal operations with normal thermal, i.e. initially with normal body temperature on admission to the operating room. I, the intervention, is the application of CFH, i.e. the carbon fiber polymer fabric resistive heating, to maintain the patient's body temperature as a warming strategy. C is a comparison against which the intervention is compared, and this is the using of the FAW, the forced air warming, as a warming strategy. O is the outcome, and this will be the careful monitoring of core body temperature for the patients and the incidence of unintentional intraoperative hypothermia, or UIH. And finally, D, the design type of study. Well, in this case, this will be a series of randomized controlled trial papers. The next part of the methodology section is an explanation of their searching strategies. They use 5 key databases, including CINAHL and Medline, and they would certainly have sought library advice on this. With each database they used, several keywords and the short phrases which they list here will have been used. Again, the library and their tutor will have helped them on this. They limited their search to English language papers only, and they put no age limit on the age of the research papers being searched. To ensure robustness in the form of reliability, i.e. repeatability, 2 independent searches were carried out by 2 of the paper's authors. They also added to the depth of their searching using a process known as hand searching, whereby the text and reference list of the papers themselves would have been carefully checked to see if any relevant papers are revealed that had not appeared in the database searches. In order to screen their initial and very likely many results, they then consider their inclusion and exclusion criteria, and this allows them to whittle down the number of only relevant papers. All the while, they'll have kept tabs on the number of papers surviving at each stage in order to produce their PRISMA flow diagram, which we will soon look at. The review paper next breaks down the inclusion criteria into 5 stages. The first one, unsurprisingly, refers to patients undergoing elective abdominal surgery. Furthermore, they should have no symptoms of fever, which could act as a confounding variable, affecting the efficacy of either the CFH or FAW modes of heating the patients. Second, for the intervention arm, the only method that should be used for the whole surgical period is the CFH. Clearly, the use of any additional methods for keeping the patients warm would, for the purpose of this review, again act as a confounder. Additionally, we are told the ambient temperature conditions that must exist in the operating theatre, once again to avoid any unwanted confounding variables. As expected, the same restrictions of patient condition and room temperature should also be true for the comparison group for the FAW procedure. We are furthermore told that only studies that themselves are randomized control trials will be considered for this systematic review. The rationale here being that RCTs are effectively the gold standard for quantitative research. And this is quite true, as indeed an RCT design is the only design that can demonstrate cause and effect. The final stage of the inclusion criteria is here actually a confirmation that the primary outcome is designated as the core body temperature and that they offer a definition of what a normal patient core temperature should be. So, through their inclusion and of course exclusion criteria, they then make an initial selection of the studies that are likely to be included in the final systematic review. Again, we are reminded that the PRISMA guidelines were used, and furthermore, that the software EndNote was used as a collection and collating tool, which initially helped to identify duplicates in the articles found. EndNote might well be worth considering in your case, as it allows any student or researcher to collect and collate their references and is furthermore facilitated by an available add-on to the Word app in Microsoft Office. After removing duplicates and other exclusions, the authors are left with 5 papers which they will now rigorously critique using a quality appraisal tool. They will then extract the relevant data using a data extraction form. They decided to delay presenting their PRISMA flowchart until the results section, which we shall presently see. So rather than using the more familiar CASP tool, they used the Cochrane Review's own tool known as the Risk of Bias tool. And I give the link and reference to both of these tools at the end if you wish to explore these further. I don't think that you as a student should see either of these as being somehow better. They both have their advantages as well as disadvantages. The Risk of Bias tool, for example, is probably more complex and so well may be more challenging to use if you are not an experienced researcher. But then again, you might argue that the CASP tools have insufficient depth. As usual, this is a conversation to have with your supervisor. They also state that they intend to calculate something called the heterogeneity, i.e. any differences in the variances of the data values across each of the 5 papers. Now, the variance is simply a measure of spread of a set of data values, which itself is just a square of the standard deviation. And it is important in a systematic review to establish that across all research papers under consideration that the spreads are broadly similar. This would indicate that in principle the data across all papers of interest came from similar populations, and so if it passes this test, then they would have strong support that the final step of a meta-analysis is permissible. In addition to the Risk of Bias tool, they also use the GRADE system, which is the grading of recommendations, assessment, development and evaluation, which is a framework for developing and presenting graded summaries of evidence. You can find more about this by clicking on the link I give in the reference section at the end of this presentation. Now, just before presenting their results section, the authors address 2 important considerations that are needed to be established before they can give themselves final permission to carry out a full synthesis. And these are a statement as to how they carried out the test of heterogeneity and something called a sensitivity test. The test for heterogeneity, which was carried out within the software known as Review Manager, i.e. RevMan, And to anticipate another piece of analysis that they will report on in the next section, they also will carry out a test of rigor of their data prior to combining or synthesizing, which is known as the sensitivity analysis, which is also carried out using RevMan. If either of these tests show the data to be too problematic, then the authors may only be able to carry out what is known as a narrative review rather than a full meta-analysis to cap off the systematic review. Both of these aspects we will come back to presently. Okay, onto their results section. They first talk about the results of the selected literature, i.e. the final Prisma diagram summarising how they arrived at their final 5 papers. Then they will give us, through the data extraction, the creation of a table of summarised key data taken from each paper. Then we'll talk about their risk of bias, which in this paper is presented visually as what is known as a risk of bias diagram. And finally, they will carry out a data synthesis which culminates in the production of what is known as a forest plot. So in summary, they start with just over 1,000 likely candidate papers spread across 5 databases, which you will recall included the FMRS Foreign Medical Literature Retrieval Service, plus hand searches. Once duplicates were removed and the inclusion criteria applied, they were left with 5 full text articles as their Prisma diagram shows. So here is their Prisma flow diagram, which you yourself are likely to produce in your own systematic review. There's a downloadable template for this flowchart which you can access from my link in the reference. And like I said earlier, having less than 10 papers for your systematic review, particularly as part of an MSc, is not that unusual. Of course, in your reading, you will come across systematic reviews with far greater numbers of final papers, and this is because systematic reviews tend to be large-scale investigations carried out by a team of researchers, and so they generally tackle research questions that have already been extensively published. Let me just show you the downloadable Prisma flow diagram. You can see it's already set up with you just ready to insert your numbers. It's a very useful document to have access to, and as I say, this will very likely survive into your write-up either as an appendix or within the writing itself. Okay, so they have 5 papers and now they proceed to extract the data. So they summarise their extracted data by the means of 2 tables, as we can see in the next couple of slides. In Table 1, we see a lot of detail here as expected. Now this first table summarises essentially the demographic data regarding the spread of ages of the participants, their BMIs and the average duration of surgery across each of the 5 papers. We are also given information about body temperature measurements, room, i.e. ambient temperature, and the types of surgery undertaken, including the type of anaesthesia used. It's worth noting that for the first 4 papers, summary values are presented as mean, as measures of the average, with the standard deviation given as the measure of spread, whilst the final 5th paper, the one by John et al., gives the median as the measure of the average and the range as a measure of the spread of data values. Moving on to Table 2, the data of interest as regards this research question, the last column is where we find the summary data of interest for each paper. Now the outcome values are presented in pairs, firstly as the carbon fibre heating blanket, the CFH resultant value, which you'll record was treated as the intervention, followed by the forced air warming, the FAW procedure resultant value, which was their control, or rather comparison group, again with standard deviations given in each case. We will explore the meanings of the p-values in the next video, but notice that only the final paper, John et al., reported a p-value of less than 0.05. This means that only this paper out of the 5 was able to demonstrate that the difference seen between the 2 heating methods was statistically significant, i.e. was unlikely to be due to chance alone. So we are none the wiser at this point in the write-up. Of the 5 research papers under review, 4 are showing no statistical significance and only 1 did. So Was this last paper a fluke? That's what the meta-analysis will hopefully show. But before carrying this out, they had to establish that there was no serious risk of bias to undermine the outcome of any further analysis. In this systematic review, they could have chosen from a range of critical appraisal tools, one of which is the popular CASP tool, which you may very well be using yourself. But in this case, they utilised Cochrane's own risk of bias tool, which has recently been updated, hence the name ROB2. The link to this tool is given on the next slide and at the end of this video. And I would suggest that even if you're not using this tool as your primary appraisal tool, that you still check it out to help flesh out your own understanding of the appraisal process. The risk of bias tool has 6 main domains for potential bias, which you are guided in considering. The first 2 consider selection bias by considering the randomization process for allocation and the blinding, i.e. concealment, for participants. The remaining 4 domains consider performance bias, detection bias, attrition bias, and reporting bias. Selection, detection, and reporting bias were all considered to have low levels across their 5 papers. The performance bias was just to be unclear but likely not to be problematic. However, attrition bias was considered high in 2 of their papers due to lost reported data, which caused some patients becoming unstable during the operation. I am including a direct link to the risk of 2 bias tool on this slide, but as you'll see, it is a hefty document at more than 70 pages long. So here's the first of 2 visualizations summarizing their risk of bias across their 5 papers. So this is the result of them having carefully, behind the scenes, carried out a full risk of bias appraisal in each paper individually. We can see paper by paper where these judgments lie. This sort of summary of the critical appraisal process is really useful and crucially is accessible also to readers of a systematic review. Like I said in the first video, this is covered in greater depth in Chapter 8 of the Cochrane Handbook for Systematic Reviews of Intervention. The second visualization chart gives their overall judgment average, as it were, across the 5 chosen papers, across those same domains of potential bias. And they conclude that overall, for their 5 selected papers, that either a low or at worst unclear risk of bias dominates their appraisals. Thus they felt giving them the okay to press ahead with data synthesis. So onto their data synthesis. Had their data extraction or earlier stages indicated the papers were simply too different, then they would decide at this point to carry out instead only a narrative review. But of course we know from the abstract that they did press on to pool their data via a meta-analysis. And part of the meta-analysis process is to carry out a small number of further checks. One in particular is called a sensitivity analysis, but more about that soon. Now, the concept of homogeneity of variance refers to how similar the variance is across 2 or more data sets, and is typically considered when used within a single piece of research where we might be looking at the comparative spread in data across 2 or more groups. On the other hand, tests of heterogeneity is the flip side of this and looks at the degree of difference in the means and spreads across 2 or more databases. It is a potential threat to the validity of the ongoing systematic review and so is typically used as part of a meta-analysis across the data arising from several research papers. Now for this there is a key test statistic known as the I-squared value, which is generated in such tests of heterogeneity. It is a measure from 0 to 100% of the degree of heterogeneity in a meta-analysis. I'll be saying more about this in video 4 when I explore in more detail the key statistics behind a systematic review. But the key thing here is that their measured value of 0% I-squared tells them that heterogeneity here is negligible, i.e. that across their 5 papers there is high homogeneity, which is good. Now, even though this was not necessarily required, they did briefly present what they called a narrative review. And here they describe the general features of their findings. Again, if you yourself are proceeding to a meta-analysis, you might talk to your supervisor as to whether you need to do this step as well. But here they highlight, as we have already seen, that 4 of the 5 studies showed that the 2 methods of patient warming, FAW and CFH, are as effective as each other, and that only 1 paper showed a genuine difference, and in that case, the forced air warming, the FAW, was the superior mode of heating patients during their abdominal surgical operations. Okay, finally onto their meta-analysis proper. Some technical details in this respect are given, which I will explore in greater detail in my video for this series. But their overall message was that when all 5 papers were taken together, the forced air warming, the FAW, is considered superior to the carbon fibre heating, the CFH, in preventing unintentional intraoperative hypothermia, UIH. And here is their forest plot summarising the results of their meta-analysis. And there's a lot of information given here, and you can see visually what you have already been told, namely that of the 5 papers considered, only John et al., which occurs as that second from the top, had statistical significance. We can see this here visually because the error bar, the horizontal lines which represent the 95% confidence interval, does not cross the 0 line of no difference for this paper and this paper alone. The remaining 4 papers all do cross the 0 line. Crossing the line means that within that 95% range of what you might call plausibility values, 0, no difference, is a plausible result, and that's why that line is of particular interest. Now, as indicated by the black diamond at the bottom, which is where all the data across the 5 papers has been pooled, the overall average indicates that the FAW process is better than the carbon fibre process. And more importantly, its width does not cross the 0 line, and so this overall result is statistically significant. Now, in the case of the overall result, the diamond, there is no horizontal line, but the horizontal extremities of the diamond shape plays the same role as that horizontal lines, namely it gives the 95% confidence interval, and you can see that that diamond does not touch or cross the 0 vertical line. To confirm this, we are told that the p-values for the overall effect is 0.01, i.e. less than 0.05, again confirming statistical significance. In addition, on this forest plot, and we're looking at the bottom, near the bottom on the left-hand side, we also see various test statistics referring to the homogeneity across the 5 studies. These test statistics, such as the chi-squared value, the degrees of freedom, df, the value of I-squared itself, and the z value, will all be explored further in video 4. Okay, so what is this mysterious sensitivity analysis that takes place seemingly after the full meta-analysis has been done? Well, it is a step-by-step process of omitting each paper one at a time, then carrying out the meta-analysis once more on the remaining papers, each time considering the change in I-square. So if one paper is dodgy, then it will be identified as having an adverse effect on the value of the I-square, i.e. on the amount of heterogeneity. And indeed, if it's considered bad enough, could even be removed from the final analysis, even at this very late stage. And again, I will discuss this further in both videos 4 and 5. However, it is worth noting for the sensitivity analysis that the John et al. Paper, here given at the bottom of the table, has the smallest value of this test statistic chi-squared, which is almost certainly due to its large sample size. And you'll recall that was the only paper out of the 500 review that by itself showed statistical significance regarding the consideration of comparison. Okay, onto their discussion part of the paper. They're going to summarize their key findings and will also give an honest reflection of the limitations of their systematic review. This last point is crucial as it shows the reader, or rather your marker, that you are fully aware of weaknesses present in the systematic review, even though they may have been outside your control. We are reminded that 5 studies made it into the final review, and we're all looking at 2 competing treatments to deal with preventing unintentional intraoperative hypothermia, or UIH. We are reminded that the overall finding was that the FAW approach was more effective than CFH, which I think has been said wrongly here by mistake. But unsurprisingly, given that only one original paper showed this result might be considered to be not fully settled. So starting with their key findings, as we have seen earlier in the forest plot, 4 out of the 5 papers did not declare a clear winner between CFH and FAW, but the paper with the largest sample size, which turned out to be crucial to this systematic review, was John et al. From 2016, which did show that FAW was more effective than CFH. They then go into a deep dive here regarding the 4 non-statistically significant papers, and they talk about sample size, means and medians, as well as Z-scores, none of which I'm going to dwell on at this time, as they are statistics that I will cover in later videos. They then move on to the dominant paper, John et al., again exploring the key statistical values, and there is also mention of a sample size calculation, which is known more correctly as a power analysis, and something called the probability of a type 2 error, which is also known as a false negative. And again, these concepts, all key to a systematic review, will be explored further in video 4. Heterogeneity, which you will recall is the extent to which the study results differed, is revisited once more, and there is mention of a one-factor ANOVA, also known as a one-way ANOVA, which was carried out to support the validity of the John et al. Paper. An ANOVA test is simply an inferential test to see if, across more than 2 groups, the means are all the same, i.e. that they supposedly come from the same population, or if at least one of them is different. The final point made in this section is an acknowledgement of the very small sample sizes in some of the non-statistically significant papers. And here they also mention something called a type 1 error, which is the probability of a false positive. But again, more about that in video 4. There is next a very technical section talking about small differences in methodology across the 5 papers, which I'm not going to dwell on here, as they will add little to our understanding of a systematic review write-up. But of course, if you're interested yourself in this particular review, then by all means do pause this recording to read in detail this part of their discussion. And the same applies here in this final subsection when talking about details regarding the measuring of the core body temperature and its relation to the administering of anaesthesia. So, before their conclusions, they offer some reflections regarding the limitations as they see it of their own systematic review, and this will be a section in your own writing as well. They identify 3 key limitations. Firstly, they note that the method of heating the patients was inconsistent across the 5 included papers, not meaning the inherent differences in the FAW versus CFH approaches, but in the amount of body covered for warming purposes, as evidenced by the extent of skin exposed in the patients. Secondly, they note that there were differences in the temperatures set for each device of the 2 approaches across the 5 papers. Thirdly, the actual measurement of core body temperature was not exactly the same, again across all 5 papers. And so we come on to their conclusions, where they will also talk about implications for both clinical practice and possible future research. They remind us one final time of the number of papers in the final review, the total number of patients that these studies cumulatively represented, the evaluation that there is only moderate risk of bias as evidenced by, amongst other things, the low heterogeneity across these studies. And they state once more that their conclusion is that the CFH approach was inferior to the FAW approach. They got it right this time, for patients undergoing elective abdominal surgeries. So they feel that, on balance, this review should be at least considered when considering actual clinical practice. In addition, looking at future research, they feel greater work needs to be undertaken regarding the occurrence of unintended intraoperative hypothermia, UIH. Also, that greater consistency is needed in matters such as body coverage, and the temperature settings of the heating devices should be addressed. A final point is offered regarding whether CFH has any role in preventing surgical site infections, and curiously, FAW is not mentioned in this respect. In addition to their few words previously about the implications for practice, they also make a further distinction and talk a little more as regards relevance to clinical practice. And here there is a reiteration that unintentional intraoperative hypothermia could contribute to serious complications during surgeries, and that, from this review, they conclude that forced air warming FAW is more effective than CFH in keeping patients warm during elective abdominal operations. Now, almost at the very end of the paper now, and there are a couple of housekeeping points to end their review. First, they declare that there are no conflicts of interest in that there has been no financial support, which implies neither of the two warming systems offered any financial incentive to this review. And secondly, they declare amongst the authors who did what in this published review. Note this slide here are their references, and I'm only showing this is just the start of their reference list. I'm showing you this to remind you that, like any piece of academic writing, it is very important to have this done completely and accurately in line with, in the case of BCU, the Harvard system of referencing. So this brings me to the end of this deeper look at a systematic review that was carried out by a BCU student. And like I said at the outset, your submitted review will be much greater in length than this published review, but I hope you find it of some use to see what a completed systematic review might look like. And these are my references to support this video. And note that whilst the Cochrane Handbook is now in its second edition as a print run, published in 2019, if you visit the web version, this is regarded as a live document, so it's being continually updated. And as usual, I display my disclaimer regarding images borrowed for this presentation. So thanks for your attention, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheerio.